everyone, it's Nina and welcome back to my channel. Today's video, we are going to be doing an updated look at my current physical TBR. I did a video like this last year in like mid-October, and now almost a year later, I thought we could revisit it and go through all of the unread books that I own. I think last year I had around 40 books on my unread TBR, and I definitely think that number has gone up since then. According to the Storygraph, I have around 75 books that I have marked as owned and unread. However, I think that is a little incorrect because there's some books that I have marked as owned in the Storygraph that I actually have in storage at my parents' house. And I also have books in the Storygraph that are marked as unread that I actually did read back in high school or college. And the Storygraph is basically just a list of the books that I have read since 2020 when I got back into reading again. So a lot of those older books are marked as unread, even though I have read them previously. But yeah, I have stacks all over my bed and over here, and I'm going to go through, show you each book, kind of talk about when and why I bought it, and when I am planning on read it if I do have a date in mind. I don't think I'm going to go through like full summaries of all of the books here because I do think that would push this video to be way too long, but I have grouped all of the books around me based on their genre. Also, I wanted to say, if you see any of the books on my TBR that you would like me to read for a dedicated reading vlog or for a upcoming wrap-up, please let me know in the comments down below, because honestly, that is like a huge push to get me to read most of them, if I have either like a deadline set in my mind, or if I know you guys are interested in seeing my thoughts on them. So, with that intro out of the way, let's get into the video. I think by categories, we're going to go from probably least popular to most popular. The first category I have is contemporary adult romance, in which case I only have one book, and that is Kiss Her Once for Me by Alison Cochrane. This is a Christmas contemporary lesbian romance. I meant to read this last year around Christmas time. I literally had the audiobook checked out and I was going to read it on like my flight to visit my in-laws, but I ended up just not being in the mood for it and reading it then. And I'm really hoping I do have the time to read it around this December so I can have it done before Christmas time. I also have no idea where I'm going to put the books I talk about. I guess I'm just going to stack them on the ground next to me. The next category I have are my poetry collections, in which I have two. Both of these I actually bought relatively recently. The first one is The Orange and Other Poems by Wendy Cope, and the other one is Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. The next category I have is manga. Manga definitely is a category that I used to have a ton of. It was like the primary thing I read in high school, but for the most part, all of my manga has been read, and most of it is actually stored at my parents' house. So the stuff I have here is just the stuff that I have bought and not yet read since 2020. The first pile I have here are the first 5 volumes of The Ancient Magus Bride by Kore Yamazaki. I actually have read the first volume previously, but I read it a little while ago and I definitely read it very quickly, so I want to reread it when I eventually go through and read the rest of these volumes. Next manga I have is the first part of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Phantom Blood. This is like the very start of the entire JoJo's Bizarre Adventure series. I have watched the anime adaptation for most of the parts of JoJo and have read a bunch of parts before they were animated, but I actually have not read the manga version of Phantom Blood, and I ended up finding this at a local used bookstore that I had credit for, so it was basically free. Don't know when I'm going to get to this, although I do own a lot of the volumes of the 4th part of JoJo, which is my favorite part of JoJo, and I probably will do a reread of in the future. Next manga I have is Boys Run the Riot by Keito Gaku. Another manga series I've been wanting to read. I'm pretty sure there's only 4 volumes of this, and hopefully if I enjoy it, I'm pretty sure one of my best friends has the rest of the series, so I will be able to borrow them from him and read the rest of it. And the last random manga volume I have here is one of the omnibuses of Yu-Gi-Oh!, the original series by Kazuki Takahashi. This is volumes 31, 32, and 34, which I believe is the end of the Battle City arc with Merrick, and then transitioning into Millennium World. Despite watching this anime multiple times, I've actually never read the Millennium World arc in the original manga, so I got this to kind of start that process of eventually reading all of that section of the manga. And I really like the omnibus editions. Just in general, I find them so much more easy to collect and buy versus individual volumes, so I definitely will be getting more of this series in the future. Okay, the next stack of books we're going to be talking about is kind of like a miscellaneous pile. It's both classics as well as like some lit fic and thriller. Basically a bunch of the hodgepodge genres that I don't read a lot of. which is this stack of books over here. The first one is The Odyssey by Homer. I actually have read parts of The Odyssey back in like middle school and high school, but I really, really love Greek mythology retellings, and I feel like it makes sense that eventually I will read the Iliad and the Odyssey in their like original forms. Next two books I have here are the only thrillers that I own. The first one is His and Hers by Alice Feeney. I'm definitely going to read this soon. I'm very excited to check out the audiobook for it, since an actor I really like is one of the narrators. And I have read two other Alice Feeney books, and while they are very insane in their premise and execution, I do find them very entertaining, so I'm excited to check this one out. And the other one I have here is The Lamplighters by Emma Stonks. I'm not sure how to pronounce her last name, but this one sounds really interesting. It's supposed to be a very like slow-moving thriller mystery, and of course it's set on a lighthouse, so I know I'm going to love it. Okay, the rest of the pile is all of my like literary fiction books. The first one is Real Life by Brandon Taylor. This is an adult contemporary that I've heard a lot about, and I've really wanted to check it out since I've heard a lot of really good things about Brandon Taylor's writing style. And I ended up getting this at a flea market for like $1, so I thought I would check it out. Next one is Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is one of the books I want to read in my 24 books for 2024. The audiobook has come up multiple times on Libby, but I just haven't been in the right headspace to read it. I really, really love Clara and the Sun, which is another one of Kazuo Ishiguro's books, so I have high hopes for this one as being another one of his like more sci-fi leaning contemporary fictions. We then have Nothing to See Here by Kevin Wilson. I heard about this book first from Jordan Reed's channel, where it was one of her like favorite books that she doesn't talk about very much, and the premise sounded really interesting to me. I've had this book for quite a while. I found it at a thrift store, I think, for another $1. And I have no idea when I'm going to read it, but I am keeping it on my shelves because I am intrigued from the premise. Next book I have is American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis. This one was a little bit of an impulse buy. I got it at another random thrift store for like $2. And I really do love the movie adaptation. Although I have heard the book is quite different and a lot grosser in some spots. At the same time, I'm very interested in seeing what this book is like. So yeah, I'll just keep it on my shelves until the eventual time is right for me to read it. Next book I have here is NP by Banana Yoshimoto. I do not remember what the premise of this book is about, but I used to be into reading a lot of different Japanese like literary fictions, and I got this from a thrift store back in like college, and it has stayed on my shelves despite the fact that I've unhauled a lot of similar books in the past, but I figured I should keep at least one if the move ever strikes me in the future. Next book on the pile is Greenwood by Michael Christie. This was a gift from my best friend who said he had heard another booktuber or YouTuber talk about it and really, really rave about this book. The premise is definitely a little bit out of my comfort zone, but at the same time I think can hit on like a lot of key things I really like in books. I just haven't read this because it is quite long, and I also haven't heard a ton of people in like my sphere of booktube talk about it, but I'm going to keep it on my shelf for a little while longer before I decide if I want to read it or not. And the last book in my literary fiction / classics pile is Wayland by Charles Brockden Brown. This book is a classic like American Gothic novel that I have been wanting to read since I got really into like the Gothic genre back in like 2020. A lot of those other books have kind of fallen off my TBR, but this one I am pretty interested in because I think it does deal with a lot of like Quaker ideals. I do think this cover is absolutely hideous. It's probably the ugliest cover in my entire collection. Okay, the next pile of books we are going to be talking about are all of my nonfiction books. I will say that the nonfiction genre is definitely the genre that I have the most overlap when it comes to sharing books with my wife. So I'm only really including a bunch here that I personally have on my TBR, but I probably would eventually read a lot of the other books that she owns as well. The first one I have is Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake. This is a book all about mushrooms. I got this, I think, in the end of 2023. And I've been very intrigued to finally check this out. My wife read it and she said she did enjoy it, but did find it to be a little slow at some parts, which has been a little bit more discouraging in terms of like forcing me to want to read it. But I think when I eventually am able to get like the audiobook, I will check this out in the future. Next book I have is Grit by Angela Duckworth. This is kind of like a combination self-help / informative nonfiction that talks about the ideas of grit and like perseverance as being the main contributor to success over talent. My wife read this book and really, really liked it, and she was telling me that I should definitely read it as well. And we ended up finding this copy at a local thrift store. I figured I would go ahead and pick it up, and I probably will read this and listen to the audiobook of it in the near future. Okay, the pile I've been building on the side is getting a little precarious, so I'm going to have to move onto the ground again. Next book I have here is They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us by Hanif Abdurraqib. This is another book on my 24 books I want to read in 2024. I read a little bit of this book as like a sample from Apple Books, and I really, really enjoyed the section that I read. I thought Hanif Abdurraqib's writing style is really, really beautiful and just so evocative and descriptive. I heard about this book initially from, I think, Mina Reed's channel, where she talked about this one chapter focusing on Fall Out Boy that made her cry and was really, really emotional. And I just have the feeling that I'm also going to be very emotional when I end up reading this book. And I think that has scared me a little bit. So that's why I haven't been able to pick it up yet this year. But I'm hoping before the end of the year, I am able to get to this one. Next book I have is The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up by Marie Kondo. A classic. I think a lot of people have heard of this book. Despite knowing a lot of the principles in it, I've never actually read the original source material for like the Marie Kondo method. So when I saw this at the thrift store, I figured I would pick it up and give it a shot. The next book I have is So You've Been Publicly Shamed by John Bronson. I heard about this book from Ariel Bassett's channel a long time ago, and it sounded so intriguing to me and very much up my alley in terms of the type of nonfiction that I like. And I just like really haven't found the right time to eventually read this, but I have held on to it for the last like 4 years, and I do think I will really like it when I eventually get the time to read it. And the last nonfiction book I have is actually one of the only Haruki Murakami's that's currently on my shelves. A lot of the other ones I have given to my father to keep in storage at my parents' house, since they were kind of like shared, owned with him anyway. Yeah, George just jumped down. And that is Underground, which is a nonfiction book about the Tokyo sarin gas attacks in the mid-1990s, which is one of like my weird niche like interests in Japanese history. I just think that the mid-1990s were really, really pivotal and super formative to a lot of elements of Japanese culture. And I did a lot of research on it back when I was in college. So this nonfiction book is definitely very much up my alley. It is quite long, and also the font is like super tiny. But again, this is just a book that I haven't really found the right time to eventually read. Okay, now that we've gone through all of like the smaller categories of books that I have, we can talk about the two main categories of books that I own, which are adult fantasy and YA fantasy. Honestly, gathering these together, I did not realize how many YA fantasies I still own that I haven't read yet, which is a little bit of a problem because I do kind of feel like YA fantasy is a genre I'm slowly moving out of. But I am still quite excited about a lot of the books that I have on my physical TBR. So let's go ahead and I'll talk about all of those ones now. Actually, I think before I move into YA fantasy, I'll talk about a couple of the like middle grade fantasies that I have. The first one I have is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. If you want to know one thing about me, it is that I absolutely love the Hobbit movie adaptations, even though they are definitely not as good as the original Lord of the Rings ones. And I've been meaning for a very long time to read both The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings series. A little bit of a spoiler for some other books I have in my adult fantasy section. So I really do eventually want to read this book and the rest of the series. And the other middle grade fantasy books that I have are the entirety of the Heroes of Olympus series. So we have The Lost Hero, The Son of Neptune, The Mark of Athena, The House of Hades, and The Blood of Olympus. I got these books for a really good deal of like $1 each at a big yard sale. And since I really enjoyed reading the Percy Jackson series, I just thought I would take the plunge and get the entire series on hardback. I haven't showed these in any other videos, but they will be probably included in the next book haul I do sometime before the end of the year. And I don't know if I'm going to get to them this year. I was originally planning on reading them actually in August, but I ran out of time, so I think I am probably going to have to push to read these probably sometime in early 2025. Okay, now we can talk about all of the YA books that I have. Actually, starting off, I'm going to talk about two YA books that I don't think are fantasy. They're actually more YA historical. The first one is By Any Other Name by Erin Coder. I've showed this on a ton of TBRs. This is one of the Dazzling Bookshop special editions that I have that is so incredibly beautiful, and I know this is a YA historical romance that's set around like Shakespearean times. I really do want to read this, ideally before the end of the year. And the other YA historical book I have is Most Ardently by Gabe Cole-Novoa, which is another Dazzling Bookshop special edition, and this one is a trans Pride and Prejudice retelling. Okay, now we can actually move on to all of the fantasy books that I have. The first YA fantasy I have is A Grim and Sunken Vow. This is the third book in the Hollow Star saga. The other two books I read and really enjoyed. However, I do think I am a little bit getting tired of this series the longer I've put off reading these books. And this one is very chunky. It's like over 600 pages. And while I do like this series, I don't know if I want to keep all of the hardbacks that I have of them on my shelves in the long run. So I think I will finish this book and then kind of decide if I want to keep all of them, and if / when I'm going to read the last book in this series. But for now, I do own this and I plan to read it, so I'm keeping it as part of my physical TBR. Next two books I have are The Stolen Heir and The Prisoner's Throne, both by Holly Black. This is a spin-off duology from the Folk of the Air series. Really excited to read these. I'm hoping I can read them sometime this fall. Just depends on if I can get the audiobooks from Libby in a timely manner. I also have Crier's War by Nina Varela. This book was a little bit of a random pick I found at a local thrift store. I think this is actually more of like a sci-fi / sci fantasy series, but I know it has a like lesbian main romance in it, and I don't own a lot of lesbian YA books, and I've heard the series is quite well loved. So I decided to take a chance and, buy this for $1, and hopefully I will enjoy it, and then possibly get the rest of the books in the series as I move through finishing this one. Now let's talk about this large stack of books I have over here. I have the next 3 books in the Old Kingdom series by Garth Nix that I have yet to read. We have Clariel, which is the 4th book in the series. That is another book that's part of my 24 books I want to read in 2024. I really love the series, and I just haven't found the right time to continue it. After Clariel, we have Golden Hand, which is the 5th book in the series. And then we have Tercel and Eleanor. I don't know why I bought this in hardback, and I don't even know if I'm that interested in wanting to read it, because it is like a prequel book focusing on 2 characters I don't care that much about. But I own it, and I probably will end up reading it once I finish the other books in the Old Kingdom series I have to read before it. The next books I have are 2 books in the Shadow and Bone trilogy. This is Shadow and Bone and Siege and Storm, both by Leigh Bardugo. I definitely am going to be reading these in a full series reading vlog in the future. I just was waiting for the right time. It might end up coming out this fall. If not, it'll be sometime next year. But I really wanted to collect the original paperback covers of these, and I have yet to find the last book, Ruin and Rising, in this edition on Pango. But once I have that, I will be reading the rest of this series. Next book I have is The Trinity Prophecy by Marissa Kinzel. I actually don't know if this is YA or adult. I think it's YA, but this book is actually written by one of my friends. And I think because of that, I'm scared to read it, because I'm like, what if I don't like it and then my friend hates me because I don't like this book? But at the same time, I'm also like, I should support my friend and read this book and learn about her little OCs, the blorbos that probably live in her head rent-free. I'm sure I will love them at least a little bit for that reason. But yeah, I have had this for at least 3 years now and just haven't had the chance to read it. I have a couple books in this next pile that are from my Dazzling Bookshop subscription. The first one is The Absinthe Underground by Jamie Pacton. This is a YA historical fantasy that has a lesbian main romance in it. I'm really excited to read this. It honestly might be one of the next books that I end up reading before the end of the month, so hopefully I can get to this very soon. Then we have Godly Heathens by H.E. Edgman. Another really beautiful edition I got from Dazzling Bookshop, and one I probably will end up reading sometime next year. I don't have a ton of plans to read it, at least at the current moment. Then we have The Spirit Bears Its Teeth by Andrew Joseph White. This is another book I'm a little scared to read. I just think it's going to be very emotional and quite dark, and I'm just not often in the headspace to read a book like that. But it is a really beautiful edition, and I've heard so many good things about Andrew Joseph White's writing style that I do want to read this at least some point in the future. And the last of my Dazzling Bookshop subscription books is Flyboy by Casey LeBlanc. This is a more magical realism fantasy that sounds really good, and I'm really, really pleased with how beautiful this Dazzling Bookshop subscription version of it is. I think this is pitched as being very similar to The Night Circus, so I am interested in checking this out and seeing what it's like. And the last of the YA fantasy books that I have is Unholy Terrors by Lyndall Clipstone. This is another book I've kind of pushed off accidentally. I really, really like Lyndall Clipstone's first book, but I wasn't really very satisfied with the second half of that duology. And this is a standalone, so I think it will be more up her alley and play to her strengths, but I just haven't found the right time to read it. I do think that in the fall time is the right mood and vibes for this type of book, so hopefully I can get to it in the next couple months. Okay, now let's move on to the last category, which is all of my adult fantasy books. The first one I have is Mist, Book of Tiana by Rand Miller and David Wingrove. This is the second book in a set of novelizations of the Mist video game series that kind of give a lot of backstory to the lore of that series. I read the first one, and it definitely was something I had looked at as a child with very rose-tinted glasses. So I'm not expecting great things from this one, although I do think this is the favorite of the 3 in the trilogy. And it's just this really, really adorable mass market paperback with this little cutout with a design underneath. I think it's so pretty. And even though I think the writing is a little poorly done in this first book in the series, I am still excited to eventually read this one. Next book I have to show is Fire and Blood by George R.R. Martin. I'm a big fan of the Game of Thrones series. I've only read the first book in that original series, but I've also become a huge fan of House of the Dragon. So I thought I would try and read the original like source material for that series. And so far I just haven't had the time. I was planning on reading it last year, but this book I know is quite dense and also kind of written like an encyclopedia / textbook. It does still seem very interesting, and I love all of the characters, so I'd love to learn more about the overall history of the world and the Targaryen dynasty. So maybe before season 3 comes out, I will be able to read this book. Next book I have is Starling House by Alexi Harrow. This is a limited edition from Illumicrate, and this is one of the only like horror adjacent books on my TBR. This I think came out in November of last year, but I think it probably will be a good pick for me to read around spooky season in 2024. Another Illumicrate subscription book that I have not yet read is To Cage a God by Elizabeth May. This book I definitely want to read in the near future. It's one of the only like fantasy romances that I own that I haven't read yet, and I also know there is a lesbian romance in this book. I was going to read it around Pride Month time, but I just like kind of ran out of the momentum to read it then. But I hopefully can get to this in the near future as well. Next book I have is another one on my 24 books to read in 2024. And that is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. This book I know is very, very highly rated and beloved by a lot of people. I know there's a BBC miniseries that's based on this, and I really, really liked Pure Nessie by Susanna Clarke, so I've been really interested in reading eventually her magnum opus. The problem is this book is like insanely long. I think it's over 800 pages, and I have seen versions of this book where it's like broken into 3 separate volumes. So I'm just not really ready to commit to such a long and dense fantasy book at the current time. The next books I have are The Last Son and The Hanged Man by K.D. Edwards. This is a queer fantasy romance series that I think is like going to be a set of multiple trilogies. There was a 3rd book out of this, and I think the start of the next trilogy comes out in like 2026. So I have a little bit of time to read these and then decide if I want to like commit to the extended universe of these books. Obviously they're fantasy romances that I've heard have a lot of similar energy to Supernatural. And honestly, say less. That's the kind of like cheese I'm really looking for in my fantasy romances. So hopefully these ones will deliver. And I think the last books I have in sort of like the fantasy romance category are the 4th and 5th volume of Husky and His White Cat Shizun by Rubal Bochi Rao. I have been reading the series kind of on and off for the last 2 years, and I just haven't had a lot of motivation to read the 4th and 5th volumes. I'm also sort of waning in interest in the series overall, even though I do really like one half of the main couple in it. I haven't really bonded with a lot of the side characters, which I think become more of a focus of the series as it goes on. And I think the series is going to be around like 10 volumes, so I just don't know if I have the space or the financial incentive to continue buying these books. I think once I finish with these ones, I'll decide how I feel about them, and I might end up selling a couple of these and just reading the rest of them through my library. Okay, as I alluded to earlier, I do have the entirety of the Lord of the Rings trilogy on my TBR. These editions are a little ugly. They're like movie tie-in ones. So we have The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King. I ended up getting these editions because they were part of a like library, like fill-a-bag book sale. So they probably ended up being like less than $1 each. And I really wanted a set of the 3 of them where they all had like the same spines and looked good together on a shelf. But like I said before, I really like the Hobbit movies and I really like the Lord of the Rings movies. So at some point in the future, I will end up reading this trilogy. Actually, probably sooner rather than later, because I'm pretty sure that The Fellowship of the Ring is Katie's Readings Patreon book club pick for September. So that's definitely a big incentive for me to finally start this series. Okay, the last books I have on my physical TBR are the rest of the books that I have in the Vampire Chronicles series that I own. So we have Pandora, which is technically part of like the spin-off series for the Vampire Chronicles. And then we have the 2 main books in the series. We have The Vampire Armand by Anne Rice and Blood and Gold by Anne Rice. These I think are books like 6 and 8 in the series, and I'm on book 4, so I do have a lot of catching up to do before I get to be able to read these books. But I definitely will be reading these in the future. I love the other 4 books in the Vampire Chronicles series that I've read. And I really want to get to know these characters more, especially as more books in the series get adapted in the live-action TV show. So those are all the books in my physical TBR. I didn't count as I was going through this, but I will be counting when I'm doing my editing. So hopefully somewhere on the screen down here, you will see the total number of books. Honestly, lugging all these books in was definitely a wake-up call. There's nothing like seeing how much you own to make you realize that you don't need to own anything more. Really just makes all of the materialism and capitalism just like flee out of my body. But hopefully you guys enjoyed watching this video. If you did, please consider liking, commenting, or subscribing if you aren't already. Please comment down below if there's any books on my physical TBR you'd like to see a dedicated reading vlogs for, or for me to just read in general so I can talk about them in a future monthly wrap-up. But that is going to be it for me today. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye!